You're probably familiar, at least if you're American, with the midnight ride of Paul Revere, when Paul Revere rode out warning Massachusetts of the coming of the British prior to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. As a refresher, here's a sampling from the famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march, by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, one if by land and two if by sea." This is the poem that made Paul Revere famous. The poem fails to mention either of the other riders that night. Few people other than historians remember William Dawes or Samuel Prescott, much less other riders like Sybil Ludington, who likely had a greater impact on the Revolution than Paul Revere did from that specific ride. And it never indicates that Paul Revere himself was captured prior to reaching his destination. I remember as a child learning about Paul Revere, and I remember at the time that William Dawes and Samuel Prescott were referenced in passing. Somebody asked the question, why don't we talk about them as much? And the remark was made that Paul Revere had a better publicist. That comment really stuck with me because it's true, not just for Paul Revere, but for tons of other historical figures and episodes. It really is a matter of who has the best publicist or the best marketing for what's remembered in popular memory. Even in Paul Revere's own life, the midnight ride greatly overshadows other aspects of his life or contributions to the Revolutionary era, like how he engraved one of the most famous depictions of the Boston Massacre and served as a militia officer. I've realized through doing some of my own historical research, just looking at old documents, how much of history is forgotten or overlooked because it's not publicized through things like the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Even in academic research, a lot of times for a topic to even come to mind for research in academia, it needs to have some sort of prominence or relevance that people will be looking for or interested in. Much of that initial awareness branches off from popular conceptions of history and stories like Paul Revere's ride. Just thinking about Paul Revere's ride really changed my conception of history. Sometimes it's thought of as there being a certain agenda or subject area of focus which dictates what history is written or remembered. Some of the time that's absolutely true, especially with certain perspectives of how history works, like the great man theory, which suggests that a lot of history is driven by great figures, often men, who dictate certain events which have cascading effects that drive all of human history, which often ignores the lower levels of society or unknown figures in history, which if you look at any original sources, it's very clear that all of those other people had an impact in sort of an interconnected web of activity at a given time. But some of the time I think that we do have things like Paul Revere's Ride, where somebody wrote a poem and that poem happened to become popular. Longfellow might not have written the poem about Paul Revere. He could have chosen William Dawes or Samuel Prescott or any other figure. His poem might not have been popular, but he chose Paul Revere and his poem was popular, and that's how it became ingrained in American popular memory as an important piece of history, even though Paul Revere's Ride in historical reality was pretty boring and didn't really accomplish much of anything at all. Because of that poem, people remember it as a significant event in our history, even though it probably really wasn't consequential at all. There's the saying that history is flawed and fragmented, in that a lot of history is lost. There's just no record of it at all, and a lot of history is recounted incorrectly. And there's definitely truth to that, but even more so than that, a lot of it is driven simply by the collective memory of a few prominent historians or figures like Longfellow who recounted historical events that are passed down to future generations and stand out as the prominent things that we remember. This has gone a long way toward dictating modern worldviews on history and how the world functions today. Once I started looking into history, I started to see the gaps where people had overlooked or forgotten certain areas, perhaps intentionally, perhaps unintentionally, but found that there were huge areas of history that seemed to just be totally missing or just totally forgotten in popular imagination. A lot of people's thoughts about really everything are dictated by just a few people's opinions and perspectives on them. This also gave me a different perspective on modern media today, and that it's the same thing in real time. Our views on things are often dictated by just a few people talking about them and giving us their opinions or perspectives from what they're seeing. This is why it's so important to have good access to good information and to verify things for yourself. A lot of times the things that are important to you might not be important to other people. even if the information is out there to find. Right now, we're living in a world that's changing very rapidly, and especially things like social media are constantly throwing new information, which can just be totally overwhelming. I have hope that in the future, we're going to have better ways of parsing that information and distilling fact from fiction and getting a better sense of worldview rather than being siloed into different categories or just being bombarded with too much information to dissect for ourselves. In terms of historical research, I'm very optimistic about the future there, and open access to historical databases and availability for anybody to do any sort of research that they're interested in. But a more pressing matter, I think, is modern media and how we're bombarded with that information constantly and needing a way to sort that out and make sense of all of it. Until we get to a place where that information is better sorted and we have a better, clearer picture of how the world actually functions, rather than just taking second-hand opinions and perspectives from others, it's important to be very critical about what you read and what you find online and to seek out the original primary sources for that data. I think of Paul Revere's Forgettable Ride as a great case study for why it's important to examine information that gets passed to us from other sources. As much as possible, try to track down information for yourself and build a worldview based off of the original sources of information that you can find, rather than relying on other people to tell you how the world functions. Once you become accustomed to tracking down information for yourself, you can build a much stronger worldview of your own and be a much more effective participant in the world.